Uh, Welcome everyone. On behalf of OHI, I welcome you all to the second public lecture by Sas Agarwal. Before we begin, let me quickly introduce you to the Oral History Association of India, OHI. In 2013, few professionals came together, realizing the need of networking, sharing, and communication among those working with recording, interpreting, and archiving oral history. And thus, OHI was established with the aim of promoting oral history in India. Through its annual conferences and occasional workshops, it provides a platform through which oral historians can share methodologies, technologies, and work practices. We also intend to develop standards for creation, collection, digitization, archiving, and dissemination of oral history. OHI has also collaborated with the International Oral History Association to bring the IOHA conference to India in 2016. We organize annual conferences on various themes and issues in oral history. So do visit our website and be connected with us through ohi.info. To know more about us, you can just log in there. And now let me not take much of your time. And I request Debarati, who is also a vice president of OHI, and she is also assistant professor and HOD of Department of English at Techno India University, Kolkata. And I request Debarati now to introduce our speaker today, Sas Agarwal. Yeah, Debarati, over to you.
Thank you, Brenda. Good evening. Hello and welcome to the public talk, the second public talk of OHI 2020 workshop. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Sas Agarwal. Now, Sas is an independent researcher, writer, and artist based in Pune, India. Her body of writing includes biographies, translations, critical reviews, and humor columns. Her books are in university libraries around the world, and much of her research contribution in the field of Sindhi studies is easily accessible online. Saaz listens to people and writes their stories. She has done this with many elderly Sindhis, recording their memories of life in Sindh just before, during, and soon after partition. These accounts have been published in the form of books, blogs, YouTube videos, and online encyclopedia entries. Her 2012 book on Sindh Stories from a Vanished Homeland is an acknowledged classic. It deals with Sindhi Hindus who left their ancestral homeland after partition, never to return, and their stories, weaving childhood memories, silence, pain, and determination to succeed in a new land with relevant and interesting facts. With an MSc from Mumbai University, Saaz taught undergraduate mathematics at Ruparel College, Mumbai for 3 years. After a brief career break, she was appointed features editor at Times of India, Mumbai. Later, she was HR and quality head of CCOM, an information technology company based in Pune. As an artist, she is recognized for her Bombay cliches. It is a quirky depiction of urban India in a traditional Indian folk style. Her art incorporates a range of media, and like her columns, it showcases the incongruities of daily life in India. Today, she will talk on memories and history, how partition touched the lives of ordinary people. Over to you, Saz.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Devarati. And thank you very much, all of you who are here today to listen to me. Thank you for your time. And I really hope that I'll be able to keep you engaged and that maybe you will also enjoy and learn something from what I'm sharing. So as Devarati said, I have been working for quite a long time, about I think 8 or 10 years, interviewing elderly Sindhis. And I'm going to tell you how I started this. It was completely by chance. And I learned a lot and I found it extremely interesting. It's something I continue to do. I'm looking for elderly Sindhis all the time. Unfortunately, the migrant generation is almost all gone. And even when I started, most of the people who I was able to interview, they were children when they had to leave their homeland. But today I'm going to, my talk is basically I'm going to share a few of the stories that I've collected, and through them I will show you the kind of insights and patterns, the impact that it had on people and places, and what I've seen to be a somewhat unexpected conclusion. And I'm going to start by talking to you about Colonel Ram Gulrajani. Now, he was just 12 years old when partition took place. And I interviewed him some years ago. And I spent quite a lot of time talking to him and hearing about his story. What he told me was that he came from a well-off family of Sindh. His father had a job with an insurance company, and he had just started investing in property near Karachi when partition took place. And it so happened that one day, they never thought that they were going to leave. And this is true of many of the Sindhis. They never thought that they would have to leave their home at partition. But what happened in his case is that one morning, suddenly a policeman came to their house and he told them, you have to leave now. And he was not a stranger. He was not a police official in that sense. He was somebody who the family knew. And they actually knew his father, who had worked in their garden for many years. And Colonel Ram's father and his brothers had actually educated this young man and arranged for him to get a job in the police force. So he was somebody they trusted. And he said to them, there's a mob and they're out killing Hindus and we won't be able to stop them. And I've come to save you and you have to run. And he gave them 15 minutes to take what they could. They rushed around the house, packed a few things, and there was transport waiting. And he took them to the house of the newly appointed Indian High Commissioner to India, Sri Prakasa. And, they were taken inside, and there was a big compound, but it was very crowded because there were a lot of other people also who were seeking protection. And they had to stay like that for 2 days. And after 2 days, they were herded into a truck and taken to a ship, and the ship sailed to Bombay. So nobody knew what was going to happen next. When they arrived in Bombay, there were government officials who took them to the railway station. And there they had to wait. And there were trains coming in twice a day. There were special refugee trains. And nobody knew where they were going. So this family, the Gulrajani family, were put onto a train which took them to Madras. And they were herded again to the Awadhi immigration barracks, where they lived for 2 years. And after that, they made their first home in independent India in Vijayawada. And that's where he grew up. Now, he went to school. He was brilliant. When he completed his school leaving examination, the senior Cambridge, he stood 8th in all of India. But the family was poor. They had nothing. They had to live. And his father never actually survived the shock of having lost everything. So between them, the mothers obviously helped to support them. And he and his siblings had to work, and they gave tuitions. And, for about 5 years, he was just working to help support the family. And then he got back to his education. He completed his post-graduation. And he was lucky enough, as he puts it, to get commissioned into the Indian Army. So he became an officer of the Indian Army. And he, being a Sikh, now this is again something, so a lot of the things that I've told you, the kind of rush in which people had to leave, the unexpectedness of the whole thing, and the random allocation of where they landed up, one doesn't really think of it like that. And in this particular case also, he was from a Hindu family, but he had been brought up as a Sikh, which is one of the customs of the Hindus of Sindh. So he was posted in charge of a Sikh regiment. And he told me about how it wasn't that easy because it was a Punjabi Sikh regiment and they looked at him a bit, with they weren't quite sure what to make of him. And he said that there was this one time where his junior commissioned officer, he came to him to ask him about some details of some ceremony to be held at the Gurdwara. And he knew he wasn't asking him because he didn't know, but it was more to test him. And he knew all the answers. He knew he was able to tell them more than that they knew. And as a result, he was accepted by them as a Sikh, which he said was his biggest success and happiness as a Sikh in the Indian Army. So what I got from this interview about, as I told you, that everything changed overnight and the resettlement was made at random. And so many young people were not able to complete their education, or there was all kinds of disruptions to their lives. And as in his case, it was the core of the family, emotional support, which took them through. But one of the things that I wanted to share with you is that he didn't think there was anything special about his story. And I think it is an extremely special story. I liked, probably because I like him a lot. I found him such a gentle, kind, and wise person. And, whatever he told me, I could relate to it. But he said, no, what is special about my story? Okay, fine, I'm a Sindhi Sikh, so that makes my story special. I didn't think that was the only thing. I put him in a book that I did. And the picture that you can see is a medal, and that is something that was retained in the family. So when you go back to that moment of them leaving their home, he was 12 years old, they had 15 minutes to leave. Somebody in the family picked up this medal, and maybe his dad put it in his pocket and, kept it safe. But they never took their property documents. And we don't know why. Maybe the documents were not in the house at that time. Maybe his father never realized that they were leaving forever and they'd never come back and they'd need those documents. But when they crossed that new border, they had absolutely nothing. So this medal is precious, and they never got compensation for their property. So I'm going to go to the next story. And this is a family. This photo was taken in Tanjung Pinang, which is an island of Indonesia. And the person who I have interviewed at length is the young boy. In fact, I've interviewed several of them, but the main story, the young boy standing between his parents, his name is Tulsi. And he was born in July 1947 in Hyderabad. And soon after that, they had to flee. So as it happened, and I'm going to tell you why it happened like that, but there were no men. It was just the women and the children and the elders of the family. So he was a baby at that time. And, obviously he doesn't remember it. I got the details from some of the elders. And they were just women. I actually interviewed his mother. His mother was no more by the time I interviewed him, but his mother's sister was alive, and she gave me an account of the train journey they made with just the women and the children. They didn't know where they were going. They had no idea. They were in a train, and there were other families like them. There were many others who did not know where they were going. And somebody would say, oh, you should go to Ajmer. So they landed up in Ajmer. Then eventually they landed up in Patna, where they stayed for a while. They had a burglary. And eventually, now his father at that time was working in Indonesia. So to find people with the kind of communications that there were at that time, it was possible, of course, and it did happen eventually. Must have been several months before his father traced them and made arrangements for them to join him in Indonesia. Now, as I learned through the course of these interviews, it was Tulsi's great grandfather, who had actually gone to Indonesia for the first time. He went to work in Indonesia. And that is another big story that unfolded, which is actually not directly connected to partition. It was something that started happening a long time before partition. And this map was plotted by Claude Markowitz, who is a French scholar, researcher. And he completely by chance stumbled upon this trade network, which he actually found two trade networks. I will just tell you about one of them, two trade networks coming out of Sindh. So the one that we're talking about now was out of Hyderabad, which is actually an inland town, but not too far from Karachi. So the traders of Hyderabad, which was actually the capital at the time when the British annexed Sindh to their empire, and the traders, soon after the British came in, they took the opportunity of using the old British steamship navigation routes to extend their business. So these young boys set out in a steamer with some locally produced products, handicrafts, which they knew were popular because the British were buying them. And they filled their trunks and they sailed off from Karachi to Bombay. And then from Bombay to Aden and, so on westward, Cairo and Gibraltar, and then the Canary Islands and so on. And uh, from, from Calcutta east. And it was in the 19th century that Tulsi's great grandfather went as a young man to work in a store in Indonesia. So these ports had Sindhi shops, and they were manned by young men from Hyderabad. The owners, the original capitalists were based, they had their head offices in Hyderabad. They traveled uh, substantially, but it was these young boys who did the work, and it was a hard life because they were selling in the shops, they were living in small rooms above the shops, they were doing their own housework, and they were getting to go home and see their families only every 2 or 3 years. Now, Tulsi himself, as I said, they grew up in Indonesia. In Indonesia also, he was quite mobile for various reasons, family reasons, but eventually the economy went down and the coup took place. And during that time, a lot of the Sindhis left and his family came back. They couldn't go. Before that, as I said, before partition, Hyderabad was the base. But after partition, they didn't have any base in India. And some of them, they managed to set up in Bombay. A lot of them set up in Pune. And Tulsi's family came. His mom and the children settled. They got a home in Pune, and the father went off to work in Hong Kong. He started his own business, actually. And Tulsi and his younger brother, they got jobs in Nigeria working for Sindhi retail chains. So he worked in Nigeria, then he joined his family business in Hong Kong, and then he went to the US where he was still with the family business, but what he was doing was custom tailoring. So it was a job where you have to measure people for suits, and then you order the suits. They're made in Hong Kong and they are mailed to the customers. From the US, he moved to Panama, and today he lives in Chile. So this is actually a story that many of these young men have to tell. And in Tulsi's case, so what happens is that it's a life of struggle, of course, and eventually some of them succeed in business, some of them struggle their entire lives. But when we did Tulsi's story for Sahapedia, he also, like Colonel Ram Gulrajani, he did not think it was a big deal. And we called it My Ordinary Life, 70 Years and 5 Continents. So this was a huge learning for me because partition, through partition interviews, I discovered this whole history about the Sindhis, which is actually, anyone, it's all there. You can see it. But it's not been documented. And I got a chance to do so because I worked with Tulsi and his family on their family history. And it was extremely interesting, the kind of things that I learned. Partition affected them, this community of global traders. Partition affected them by displacing them from their homeland the way it did for everyone. But for them in particular, because they would come back to Sindh just once in every 2 or 3 years, they lived away from their families. And after partition, they had to take their families with them wherever they went. Mostly, they moved to those trade outposts, and those trade outposts developed into communities. And there were, of course, cases where the men could not afford to keep their families there, and they set up, small home in India, in Pune, which in those days was not, the real estate was not as expensive as Bombay. The education was good, and the children went to good schools, and as did happen with Tulsi's family also. So partition affected them by in a different way. The families mostly became, they were separate before, but after partition they stayed together. So here I had this thing that I discovered this whole global trade, and also about how partition affected them in a different way than one expects partition to have affected anyone. The next person I'm going to tell you about is VP Chabria. He was born in 1930, and he was 12 years old when his father died. Now, I should also tell you that when I interviewed him at length, I mean, many, many hours. And the purpose was nothing to do with partition. It was nothing to do with being a Sindhi. It was basically to help him put together his memoirs. And he was 78 years old at that time. It was way before I had started working on the Sindhi on doing any Sindhi interviews. It was more, at that time, my focus was more on the industrial history of post-independence India, and he is a classic case because his company Finolex was one of those which started in I think around 1956, which was pretty early. So he was 12 years old when his father died, and his family lost everything. His elder brothers, who then became the heads of the family, they were just 16 and 20 years old, and they would, I suppose they were taken advantage of, or they were, the family lost everything. They lost everything to the extent that they lost their home. They had nowhere to go. And young Prahlad, at the age of 12, he never went to school after that. He never sat inside a classroom after the age of 12. He had to go and work in somebody's shop, and in a cloth shop, somebody known to the family. And this is a boy who used to have a servant help him put on his clothes, and he had to go and sweep the store and, wash the owner's vessels after he'd had lunch and so on. So he did a series of menial jobs of that kind until eventually one of his jobs was sitting in a truck to make sure that the driver wasn't stealing petrol. And it was for like 7, 8 months. And during that time, it was a Pathan truck driver. And PP was the kind of person who was chatting in Pushtu with the truck driver. I mean, he was a very quiet kind of person, but he was really smart, and he picked up, he was so good at languages. When in Pune, he would make speeches in Marathi and not in English or Sindhi. But I'll tell you about why he came to Pune. It was because they had relatives in the city, and they needed a place where he could stay. And he came actually, and he did menial work in the family, for the family that he was living with and who was giving him a home. So he was this boy who would wake up early in the morning to get the milk, and stay up till late at night to fill the water and, these kind of things, sweeping the house, sweeping the shop, which was across the landing, and bringing water and tea for the customers and so on. When partition took place, his family, because they were still in Sindh at that time, but because he was in Pune, they joined him and he and his brother started a business. So I will quickly show you the photo of him and the brother who he started Finolex with. This was in the 60s, and this was in 2008 by the time they become industrialists. And this is my favorite photo of the boy who, who was doing menial work in his own private plane. But what I learned from him, and this is something again which we don't really think about partition as having done. So he told me about the early days of his business when he started dealing in electrical accessories. So, he would ride around on his bicycle and show the shopkeepers of Pune the products that he'd got. Now, he told me that he had worked for a while in Amritsar before they sent him to Pune. And in Amritsar, he was working with his sister's husband, and his job was to collect money from people who owed them money to go again, walk around or ride around and go and collect money from the customers who owed them money. And he said, the bazaar was bustling and the shopkeepers would be hanging out, calling the customers, Aja, Aja, and, showing their products. In Pune, when you entered the store, the owner would be sitting behind a desk and he'd look at you and say, Kai. So the culture was completely different. They did have stores. So what happened is they came in and they brought their culture and they changed the business flavor. They changed the feel of shops. They changed how business was done. And uh, so that's another thing which I realized later when I started thinking about partition. PP Chabria, and there was another person called SP Malhotra who started a company called Wakefield, who I also worked with. The kind of culture that they brought with them was different from the local culture. They changed Pune. The Sindhis, as we know now, I know this now, and it never struck me before, that when they settled in the refugee camps, it was a terrible thing for them that their children's education had been interrupted. So, right there in the camps, under the tree or in a spare room, they started schools. And I interviewed this lady called Nalani Advani, and she told me how she was 17 years old, and she had planned to study and study and study as much as she possibly could, but partition took place and she landed up in this refugee camp, and they had no money, so the boys were getting educated, they were going to school, and she was sitting at home and doing crochet or whatever. And when the school was started in the camp, she volunteered to be a teacher. And so they had just an empty room. The children sat on the floor. There were 3 volunteer teachers. And at the end of the month, they collected fees from the parents. And with that, gradually, they were able to buy furniture for that room. They were able to pay the teachers. And over time, the other educationists and senior teachers who had also been displaced by partition, some of them joined. One of them mentored her. She went through her teacher training examinations, and she became a professional teacher. And this school, which started as one room in a refugee camp, became the Navbharat High School in Mulund, which has 8,000 students today. And there are similar stories of the colleges, like one of my favorite stories is National College, Hyderabad, where it was called National College in Hyderabad, and it closed because of the situation before and during partition. And in November, the college opened, and 8 students came, or maybe even less. I can't remember the number. It's been documented. But that everything had stopped because most of the students and most of the teachers were Hindus, and they had fled. So there were very few left, and there was this uh, Professor Kundanani, who decided that he can't let it lapse like this. And he took a trunk and he packed some books and some laboratory equipment, and he got a pune of the college to go with him to the railway station. And at the railway station, and this I read about, it's not an interview that I did, but I, I read that the pune he said that at the railway station they were stopped and he was asked what's inside the trunk, and apparently he said it's treasure. So they opened the trunk and they found books and they said, okay, fine, you can take it, and he went. Now the person I did interview was a boy who I mean, someone, he's elderly now, but he was a boy and he lived in the house, safe home where a lot of the people who'd come from Sindh were staying, and one of them was Professor Kundanani. And he said that, he used to leave the house in the morning and he would come back at night. And we didn't know where he'd gone, but we did know that he was looking for a place to start National College again in Bombay. So every Sunday, he would sit down and he would write a stack of postcards. And he would do this every week. And he was writing to his former colleagues at National College in Hyderabad. And they were all over Ajmer and Bhopal and Jaipur and wherever. And he would write to them saying that we're going through a difficult time. Do whatever you have to do, whether you're working in your uncle's shop or you're giving tuitions or you're frying tikkis to keep your family going, that's fine. But I'm going to call you back. I am starting National College in Bombay and you'll have your job again. And eventually he did. A lot of effort, persistence, and support from the community and National College in Bandra. This is the story of National College in Bandra. And Jai Hind College also has a wonderful story like this. So the skyline of Bombay, that's another thing, because when the Sindhis came in, housing was a huge problem. And some of them had experience as government contractors and builders in Sindh. So they built homes for themselves and their families. And these were not done for profit, from what I've heard, from the stories I've been told by the people who moved into their homes. I've learned that the early homes were built because they were a necessity and they were done for the people themselves and as a support for their families. But once they'd done it, they just kept going. And you look at Bombay skyline today, and a lot of it comes from partition. This is one thing that we never really think about. Sindhis actually are not a glamorous lot. There's a lot of prejudice against them. There's a feeling that they're not very cultured, they're, tasteless and shrewd and conniving and so on. But what we don't realize is how much they lost. And I'm not talking about the material loss, which was significant, because these people who came to Bombay, they were urban and they were pretty well off. So because they lost their state, their ancestral homeland, there was no place where Sindhi was spoken on the streets. Parents stopped talking to their children because they wanted them to integrate in the places where they moved. Now there's a lot of effort to revive Sindhi. We have something called the National Council for the Promotion of Sindhi Language, which is an arm of the Indian government's HRD ministry. And there's a lot of funding, there's a lot of good work, but a language, these are artificial initiatives. It's not, you need something that grows organically, and that's just not possible. And the fact is that in Sindh, and this is something that I never imagined until recently, Sindhi is a language of poetry and philosophy. And nobody knows that, not even the Sindhis themselves. So now I've come to this point where I'm going to tell you how I started working with Sindhis. It just so happens that my mother was a Sindhi. But, I never really considered myself a Sindhi, partly because I grew up, we had a very cosmopolitan upbringing, my brother and I. We went to boarding school. And we'd have 1 month holiday with our Sindhi grandparents every year. And then I lived with them when I was in college, as a result of which I can somehow understand the language, but I never considered myself a Sindhi. And this photo is actually quite symbolic because it's at the Jaipur Literature Festival. And my father had died recently. And that's how I was able to take my mom to Jaipur. I used to go every year. I was the books guy for the Sunday Midday, which is a Bombay tabloid. So I was very fortunate that I got to enjoy the Jaipur Literature Festival every year for the first few years. And my mom, when I was going, she would always say, "Oh, I wish I could come with you." And I would say, "Come, but you just have to buy your ticket." But, we couldn't leave my dad. He had Parkinson's, very advanced, and one of us had to be with him. So the year he died, I took her. And then, or at least he died in August, and this was January. And I was very engaged in trying to keep her occupied, make her feel wanted, make her do something interesting. And I said to her, I work with people to help them write their memoirs. Why don't we do something together? None of us in the family know anything about your childhood. So why don't you tell me? And, the idea was to do something for the family and get photos from whoever had them, her cousins or whoever. And she was very sporting. She would come and sit down in front of me and she would talk. And on the second day, I realized, because she was telling me things that I thought everybody should know. Now, she knew this. She was only 13 when partition took place, but her father was a lawyer and she remembered some of his high profile cases. And one of them was to do with something that happened in 1936, which is that Sindh was separated from the Bombay presidency and it was made a province with its own government. And eventually that led to the resolution for Pakistan being passed on the floor of the Sindh Assembly. So there was several things that happened after the separation. The separation was not done on communal for any communal reason. It was done because Sindh was not getting proper attention, and they felt that it would be better administered by its own people. But it worked out to be different. Now, when I heard this and I realized it's a big story and it's not been done, so I have to do it. So it wasn't just my mother's story after that. I interviewed a lot of other people, and that's what got me started. And, read a lot. I used secondary sources. Full oral history stories from people, but I have used secondary sources alongside, some of which corroborates what people said, some of which contradicts. And I love those stories where everybody's got their own version of the same event, because I think that's so important for us to understand. So one of the things I wanted to tell you about is that I'd finished with the book, and suddenly one day, my mother said to me that, we were talking about something, and she said, "But, we could go and fly kites any day. We could fly kites any day because it hardly ever rained in Sindh." And that's when I realized that these people arrived in Bombay and it was pouring and pouring and pouring with rain. What was it like for them? She'd never seen, she said I'd seen an umbrella in the movies, but I'd never seen an umbrella in Sindh. And in Bombay, what do you see when it's raining? And then, apart from the umbrellas, you're a child and you're writing from right to left. And then you come to a new place and you have to learn to write the other way around. So one of the things, like I've been telling you, that when you talk to people, a lot of times they don't think they have anything interesting to tell you. Even someone like Tulsi, who's lived in 5 continents, he thinks his life is just normal. But for an observer, there's so much to learn. And as in this case with my mom, I felt that, it's kind of like a combination of looking at them objectively and putting yourself in their shoes. And that's what I think brings out good stories. Um, so, of course, I already said this about the Sindhis having lost everything. They lost more than they realized they had. Now, the other complicated thing that happened because of the way partition took place. So this statue that I'm showing you is Harchandrai Vishndas. And soon after partition, his head was lopped off. His statue stood outside the Karachi Municipal Corporation building. He was one of the founders of the municipality. But because he was a Hindu, his head was chopped off, and the statue continued to stand for a while. I've been told, I've heard, I'm not sure if this is true, but apparently the statue was headless outside the building. And today it's in a warehouse somewhere because um, that which happened before 47 was denied. And this is a photo of me and my family visiting the Hyderabad railway station, Hyderabad Sindh railway station. This is the station master on the right. And I went there looking for traces of my great-grandfather, who my mother had told me was the station master. So it was such a great thing to meet the station master, who was very warm and welcoming. And as you can see, he ordered chai. But there was, I could see through the rooms that there's this old furniture and cupboards and chairs, which probably my great-grandfather sat on. But when you look at the boards, there's no trace of anyone or anything before 1947, because everything, and he told us this station master told us this, that we destroyed all the records. We don't have anything here. And he was a man who was interested in history because he had these boards with photos and, across, you can see behind, at the end of, on the wall, that's a list of important events but nothing before 47. And it becomes so complicated because the refugees didn't carry their history. They lost everything. Most of them left their documents and their photos because they fled. And in their lives, they left their, they didn't carry on their stories. And in Sindh, the traces of their memory were wiped out. And I have actually met researchers who wanted to fill the gaps. I met someone who had worked for many years towards her PhD, and she eventually gave up because there was no way she would find actual documents and there was no way she could prove anything because it just wasn't there. And even the things that are there now are getting destroyed. So that's where we stand. Nearly finished with our time. So I'll just be as fast as I can with these last two bits. This is a photo I came across in a college magazine, DJ Sindh College Magazine, 1937. And I was doing this book for a community, which is the Amal Panchayat. And so I interviewed, I don't know, maybe 200 people, maybe more, and tried to locate these women. So I found some of them, tried a lot. I mean, in a small community, you can actually find people. So we found some of them, and I captioned this photo in the book with their names. There was the story of Duru. I'd been told this by somebody from the family. Duru is no more. She died many years ago. But the way they spoke of her, I mean, she was a lovely woman who, after partition, helped support her family. She taught her children are, really, like one is an artist, one runs Indian Cultural Association in New York, and they are, happy and fulfilled people. I never knew that Duru was one of these ladies too until I interviewed one of her daughters recently. So it's like, putting puzzles together. And I don't want to end with this horrible slide, but I wanted to say that we think of partition as the worst time where the communities were fighting with each other. But in almost every one of the stories that I've recorded, every one of the histories, every one of the people that I've spoken to, almost always I've been told that they saved us. And everybody has an incident, including in my family, of people who helped them, who went out of their way, not just friends, sometimes strangers, sometimes the new settlers, who went out of their way, put their own lives at risk to help them, to protect them, and to save them. And that's all from me for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Saz, for this wonderful stories. These are so touching stories. And I would say that through her presentation, Saz has discovered how, through the partition interviews, the entire history of the Sindhi people of that point of time. And I do have some questions from my end, but before I ask anything to Saz, I would request all of you, those who have questions, to please raise your hand, or you can just write your question in the chat box. And for those who are watching it live on Facebook, you can just comment it in the Facebook page as well. So, any questions, any raised hands? Okay, so while we are waiting for others to talk, let me speak first. Being the prerogative of this, as a moderator, I'm taking this prerogative. So, Sas, I'm very interested to know about those people who were not traders, who were, say, who had lands of their own, say the farmers who had to leave vast amount of land behind, and they had to start from scratches here.
Yeah.
So, do you have any stories like that?
So, in fact, Colonel Ram Gulrajani's father had land and he never got compensation. So, there were actually in Sindh before partition, there were three uh, elites, and one was the landed gentry, and one was the trading community who were wealthy. A lot of it, as I told you about the international trade, so they were coming in, bringing money, bringing foreign exchange into. And the third were the professional class, which was also very, very, I mean, quite substantial. Like I told you about the book I did for them, The Armils of Sin. So you asked me about how the people with lands settled. I think for them it was the hardest because those who only had lands and were living like princes of their lands, there weren't that many, but there were quite a few. I mean, they weren't the majority. In that sense, there weren't that many. It was the hardest for them because they had no options. They had been used to living like kings and they never got, I mean, they lost that completely. They didn't know anything else. So it was hard for them. There was a, initiative. I mean, really, we have to admire the Indian government who had nothing for the way that the refugees were looked after. They did a lot. They had the camps. They had all kinds of programs. They tried to give compensation, but it was too big a task, and India was a poor country. So that's what it was.
Thank you so much, Saz.
Thanks.
So we have questions in the chat box. So Rashmi Menon, do you want to speak so that we can unmute her? She had some
Yeah.
questions in the chat box. Okay, please, Rashmi, go ahead.
Saz, I had two questions for you. One was were there any memories that many in the community didn't want to talk or elaborate on? And the second question was that did you have to deal with rehearsed narrative or people who wanted to portray uh, their their history in a certain way?
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
And how did you work around that?
So, as I said, my grandparents were Sindhi, but they never talked about, it was over. And when I started, asking my mother questions, she told me that one of my uncles used to keep asking my grandfather to tell him about life in Sindh. And he would say, oh, why should we talk about something that's over? So it was a very, very concerted decision. And it wasn't just one family. I mean, the entire community did. They all left. They all moved on. They never looked back. Very few actually nurtured their family stories. They weren't talking. And that's That's so one reason I think is also because that the story is less glamorous because they didn't have the kind of bloodshed and violence and women being forced into wells, and that wasn't there. That's not part of the sin story at all. So anybody who had a partition story really just didn't feel it was worth talking about because it wasn't, as bad as they just felt that they were the lucky ones. Now, regarding the rehearsed things, yeah, of course, especially when, I was working on the book for the Panchayat, where they actually wanted to highlight achievements. And I felt it's much more valuable to the future generation to understand what life was like. And, there's enough of achievement in just dealing with your difficulties and moving on. You don't have to, be the president and have won the prize and been to Stanford and Harvard and everything. You can, it's so much more interesting when there's depth in the story. So how I dealt with it was, I think I just listened to them and then started chatting, and then listen. People like to talk, and people really enjoy exploring lives when somebody wants to listen with a lot of interest and without judgment. So that's how I did it, and I mean, I think any of us can do that. Thanks, Rashmi.
Thanks, Saz.
Okay, thanks, Rashmi.
I think we've lost Deborah a bit.
There's an interesting question here from Brinda Kumar, who says a lot of the accounts mention a loss of land, of leaving behind everything. Did you also come across accounts or narratives of those without land or resources and their experience after partition? I don't know.
You're on. Shall you speak?
Yeah, but Indra ma'am has
Can you
a question. I think I'll wait for that and then I'll interact on a personality.
I actually, now that you say this, I feel so diffident. I have to admit that I have very few stories of people who didn't have much and they came, and, for them, life was a continuation of what they had before, but in a new place. And they got on with it. They made the best of their opportunities. I remember this one story that my grandfather had, which was about how, because he got settled fairly well after partition. My grandfather had 5 kids and he was a lawyer, and he got a job. A friend of his took him on. And soon after that, a few months later, he was appointed as a magistrate of the Bombay presidency, which is not something you can apply for. It's like, you get appointed. So he was in the local train one day and he saw a Sindhi boy selling combs. And he didn't need a comb, but he gave the boy money, and the boy refused to take the money. He said, you want a comb? I'm not a beggar. You want to give me money? Then you take a comb. Now, I wanted to know, of course, I heard the story from my dad, and much after my grandfather died, so I couldn't ask the question, did you speak to him in Sindhi? But to answer the question, that boy who was selling combs was probably one of those who, didn't have land, and he and his family had come, and they were living in the refugee camps. I have an aunt whose husband was a camp commandant in one of the refugee camps. This is from my non-Sindhi aunt. And she told me this, that they were so hard working. I would get, if I got up at 4 o'clock to go to the loo, I would look out of the window and I would see this huge mass of people walking, all wearing white, and they're walking to the railway station at 4 o'clock in the morning, because they had to get to Bombay and be there for work. So, that's what they did. They got up early and they walked to the station, took the train, and went to work. I don't have, unfortunately, I haven't done enough of stories of people who have, enough of interviews of people who have that kind of background.
Thank you, Saz. So we are moving on to Shivani, who wishes to interact with you. So
Yeah,
Shivani,
thank you. Hello, Saz ma'am. As I mentioned before that I had interviewed certain pioneer women educationists, and one of them was Miss Mohini Manglik, who was a child while partition and her family moved from Pakistan, and her brother Ram Advani. And Ram Advani came. I hope you know him.
Lucknow.
Yes, Lucknow, and he had a very well-known bookstore as Advani bookstore. He's no more, but Mohini ma'am is still there, and she became a professor in English, a very well-known professor in English in Lucknow University, and she's still there. So your stories pull me back, and I think I'll be interacting her with her again.
But
So
you know,
I was
their family did not come during partition. They came in 1927.
yes, they migrated before. They were not. I mean,
They were not partition.
yeah, they were not. They did not suffer as such what the partition thing was, but they migrated. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Shivani.
so any more questions? If not, Saz, I just am very keen to hear how did you gain their trust? These people didn't know you beforehand, right? How did
So
you
most
make
of
them
them.
open up?
So I can only repeat this, that when you sit down with somebody and you give them the feeling that you like them and you're interested in their story, and you are not judging them for anything, because you respect who they are, whatever it is. I can't think of any. I mean, I'm not trying to do. I'm not trying to get anyone's trust, but this is how I feel when I'm talking to somebody, and I think it works.
Right.
And like, as we've been discussing earlier today also, people tell you everything. You have to be careful with the knowledge that you get. You just have to be discreet. You have to understand. Thank you. Thanks for loving.
Thank you. And any more questions over here or at Facebook? Okay, so Brinda or Venkat, do you have anything else to add?
Saz, thanks so much. As you know, I've started looking at your book as well in the last few days, and it's been
Thanks.
quite the exquisite exploration. As an archivist at this point in my life, I'm always curious about where material lands up. So, could you talk a little bit about any resources where material, within families, for instance, and have they been looking for places to deposit them for posterity? Just be genuinely curious about uh, what happens to all these sort of everyday objects that people sort of have with them. Thank you.
The sad thing is most of it has been thrown away. People don't value it. And when I find a family who has documents, I scan, and I keep soft copies and request them to hang on to it. But people are still throwing away things. And if you want, I can just go back to everyone and stuff, and we can work together on that if you like. I need to think about who I know for sure has stuff. There are a few, very few families who really, respected and protected and preserved their photos. But the thing is, even they don't know who's in those photos. They don't know where they were taken. They don't know, um, you know, what the event or what the events were. Because there's no one there who will tell them. Mm. But yeah, I mean, anytime I know lots of people, and we can go back to them and get stuff. If we can do that. I'd love to.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think it'll be great. There are enough repositories that we can sort of connect them to. And of course, there's this, I mean, the same question that came up a little while from Debarati as well. This question of trust is all pervasive in a way.
Yeah.
So they do need to feel the trust that the material is going to a meaningful place.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for what you've done, because I think it gives us a window into how they've thought about their stories and how they've connected the past to the future.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for listening to me and for, sparing your time. It's such a big thing. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Sas. Over to you, Venkat.
Brunda, do you want to wrap things up?
Yeah, so thank you everyone for attending this workshop, as well as because there are some workshop participants also who are attending the public talk, and also the others who could join us for this. So thank you, and thank you, Saz, once again for agreeing to this. And we look forward to our next workshop, and we hope to soon organize few more public lectures during this pandemic. So thank you once again, and do log into ohai.info if you would like to know more about Oral History Association, and do consider taking a membership so that we can interact more with you all. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all.